Hello. Today we'll be talking about capitalism beyond Europe. Capitalism beyond Europe basically would be a case study of two major developing capitalist economies of the world outside the European continent. These are USA and Japan. Capitalism emerged as a distinctive phenomenon in northwestern Europe, but then gradually spread across the globe. Historians have, however, looked for its basic features as they emerged in Europe, which is to say, the primacy of market forces in economic exchange, centrality of incentive driving supply of a commodity, production for profit rather than for immediate consumption, aiming essentially at markets farther afield. A generation of Marxist historians have even struggled to find evidence from other parts of the world for a transition from feudalism to capitalism in areas which had, one could say, neither seen feudalism nor had seen capitalism. Over time, a historical consensus has come to emerge that capitalism began to surface in different parts of the globe at different times since the 18th century, mostly in response to the exposure to the capitalist variety that Europe brings into light. In some parts of the world, mercantile capitalism emerged in direct contact with the transcontinental European commercial network. Generally, this applies to those colonies of Europeans that were set up in places like North America and Australia, Oceania. Elsewhere, local variations of mercantile capitalist traditions had to adapt itself to industrial capitalism of the European variety in order to survive. Some of this experience, as in Japan, were to safeguard the political dispensation from foreign invasion. Still others were in response to the penetration of corresponding societies and the economies by forces affiliated to industrial capitalism. This could be true for sovereign kingdoms such as China, Persia, or the Ottoman Empire, or could be true for societies which were living under colonial occupation, such as the countries of South Asia, of Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. These cases seldom followed the original European prototype. The two case studies that we would be looking at are those of the United States, which saw capitalism backed by private capital, and Japan, which saw capitalism with a degree of state patronage. To look at the US case first, there is a general agreement that capitalist archetype developed in the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. It involved, meaning the prototype involved, market forces mobilizing private capital, investing it first in commercial and then agricultural and industrial ventures during the 17th and 18th centuries. Among the experiments with capitalism worldwide since then, this particular archetype was replicated primarily in regions that were colonized by people from northwestern Europe, simply carrying existing trade practices into new colonies. Such experiments took place in North America, Australia, Oceania, and also parts of Africa where the European colonials settled in the 18th and 19th century. The most sophisticated and the most successful variety of this is to be seen in the United States of America. In the 17th century, immigrants from all over West and Central Europe had gone and settled down in the Atlantic seaboard of North America. Germans, French, British, and Dutch, and people of other nations settled down and closed ranks against the indigenous Indian people to form the 13 colonies that later went to constitute the United States. Now, in this first phase, that is to say the 17th century, faced with Indian resistance and also competition from the French in the region of Quebec in the north, these 13 colonies offered their allegiance to the British Crown looking for military security. They began trading with primarily the metropolitan country, but then eventually also with other European countries and even other European colonies of North America. They exported primarily commodities like maize, molasses, and minerals, that is to say primary and basic foodstuff, in exchange for imports from Europe, which comprised primarily of manufactured goods, industrial goods. As their population grew in the colonies, economic self-sufficiency gradually began to develop with the rise of hard-working farmers and skilled artisans who began to produce those commodities which previously would have been imported from Europe. By the middle of the 18th century, the 13 colonies of North America were economically self-sufficient, and therefore they went on to sever their political ties with Britain and created the United States of America. Europe, however, continued to be the principal point of reference in this life of the fledgling republic as it had been during the colonial times. People continued to travel back and forth from Europe, hence the people of America, we will now refer to them as Americans, the Americans remained abreast of developments in the continent. When in the early 18th century, therefore, England embarked on a massive expansion of its agricultural production, its agricultural output bloomed as a result of what is known as the Agricultural Revolution, similar capitalist practices began to be introduced in American agriculture as well. The propensity towards adoption of new technological innovations in the 18th century that characterized English manufacture also began to be swiftly carried to the Americans. When mechanization began in England in the 1770s, USA, incidentally, was the only country who followed the lead immediately, without any delay. Mechanization was, in fact, adopted sooner in the United States than even in the European mainland because it solved a crucial problem. The United States of America is a vast land. Compared to that, the population living in the vast territories that made up the 13 colonies of the United States was very little. So there was a serious problem of labor shortage. So while Europe deterred, fearing that if mechanization were to take place, it would displace labor from existing cottage and artisanal industrial ventures, the problem of labor-abundant Europe, comparing to that, Americans warmed up to the idea of mechanization because it allowed things to be done that could not be done previously on account of labor shortage. Technology was thus borrowed from the mainland and adapted to the American setting and swiftly replicated across all the states. So whenever a new innovation was heard of in England, someone coming from England would bring the wind of it. That model would be, the stereotype would be that the prototype would be replicated in the US, and then it immediately spread across the 13 colonies. So it's not that there were enclaves of industrial development in the United States. In the United States, mechanization begins from the very beginning, and it begins across the geographical spread. Very often, American adaptations turned out to be more productive per unit of labor than its European prototype. A very good example is the use of spinning jenny, which, when the spindles began to spin cotton in America, were spinning more cotton per unit of spinning jenny than they had done in England at the height of the agriculture industrial revolution. Now, because Americans adopted the European, which is to say primarily British techniques and machines, almost as soon as they were devised, they were able to start out with mechanization with almost as little capital as the English had themselves. Because it is easier to start innovating with one machine than have a huge factory of 1,000. So the Americans were able to mechanize almost one workshop at a time using one machine at a time, but then they built it steadily. It was an incremental development. Hence, while in European industrial capitalism was premised essentially upon huge capital investments because they needed to catch up with England, but that was racing ahead, industrial capitalism in the United States turned out to be more evolutionary and therefore less oriented towards huge capital investments in the initial stages. Hence, like England, And unlike most countries of the world, industrial capitalism in the US was built on the enterprising spirit of the merchant capitalist who became an industrial entrepreneur with little or no state support. Adoption of technological innovation too was easier for the USA than it had been for Europe. For instance, the switch from charcoal to coal, largely because of the nature of the choices being made. America had abundant coal reserves, and the marginal benefit of switching from charcoal to coal turned out to be almost as good as it was in England compared to any other part of Europe that you can think of. Iron was nearly as plentiful as in England, for iron smelting innovations also to be carried through quite rapidly. So even as England was undergoing its first age of mechanization of iron production, of blacksmithy, the Americans followed steadily suit. So the Americans not only followed Europe in adopting new technology, by the 1830s, in some respects they even raced ahead. Railways began operating in the Americas around the same time as they did in mainland Europe, and electricity was in operation by the end of the 19th century. By 1900, USA was the largest economy in the world and the largest exporter of agricultural produce on account of mechanization of its agriculture, much before any European country mechanized its agriculture to that extent. By the early 20th century, advances made in the automobile industry made USA the global leader in the growth sector of industry. To compare this model against the Zaibatsu capitalist model of Japan is also no less interesting. Unlike European settler colonies, non-European societies were always confronted with the question whether they would adapt Western mode of industrial production in toto, whether they would adopt everything that comes with the new innovation, or would they selectively continue with traditional modes of production. So mechanize where it's required and don't where it is not that pressing. Japan was among the earliest non-Western societies to tread the path of industrial capitalism successfully and therefore to face this particular problem. It emerged as a major industrial economy within half a century of starting out in the direction of industrialization. Historians have since then struggled with the question, did Japan emulate the West blindly and adopt Western techniques, Western practices in toto, or did it modernize atop the foundation of its own socio-economic tradition? To understand this dilemma, one has to look at the case of 19th century Japan. Historically, Japan has been a very insular culture which has regulated entry of foreign merchants and nationals very strictly, very rigorously. So society, economy, and polity over a time became heavily feudalized as significance of commerce declined in course of the second millennium AD. The power of the Mikado, which was the emperor in Japan in 19th century, was very tightly circumscribed by the shogun, who was the head of a heavily feudalized military government wielding authority in the name of the Mikado. The emperor, who was considered to be a reincarnation of God on earth, was essentially kept as a sideshow. He was the de jure sovereign. Real power was held by the feudal military aristocratic apparatus, on the top of which remained the shogun. Now, after 2 centuries of such a shogunate of the Tokugawa clan, in the 19th century, Japan was left much weaker than before. The Portuguese had already gained a toehold in Japan in the 17th century. The Dutch had followed towards the end of the 17th century themselves. And in course of the 18th century, the British and the Americans began to gain an interest. And in the 19th century, they came forcefully knocking on the doors of Japan so that the doors would be held ajar for them. Major military defeats in 1862 and 1864 led to the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate as a reaction from the Japanese feudal aristocracy. But then the entire stage was upset by the rise of forward-looking bureaucrats called the Rangakusha in the name of Mikado. And these Rangakusha brought about what is known as the Meiji Restoration, the story of modernization of Japan. By 1869, as a part of this restoration, the feudal institutions were completely abolished. Fiefs were converted into centrally administered prefectures. Feudal dues were converted into taxes, which now became payable to the central government instead of to the feudal lord. And Japan, determined to hold out against the West, decided that it had to become as strong as the West in order to hold it out. Here begins the story of Japanese industrialization. From the very beginning, the Japanese hired foreign experts and then also sent their own agents abroad to find out about developments in the West. Although Japanese economy was largely agricultural till as early as the 20th century, as late as the 20th century, the government undertook to build railways with money from its own resources in 1872, so that by 1890, less than 20 years, around 1,400 miles of railway track were laid down. Now, this figure might compare unfavorably vis-a-vis countries like Germany, but one has to remember that Japan is a cluster of 4 major islands. 1,400 miles simply means that there was no part of Japan which was very remote from a railway station. Telegraph lines were also set up to connect all the major towns of Japan by 1880. So Japan was becoming physically integrated using the devices of the hated West. European-style banking system was also introduced in 1882. The technology and expertise required for these were imported from the West, but the government ensured that such expertise would not have to be imported from the West forever, that they could be replicated at home. Hence, the Japanese government completely remodeled public education along the lines of the German public education system to ensure the Japanese students had the same scientific aptitude as any of his Western counterpart. Most of the capital required for this import of technology in the first phase was provided by the government. However, within 2 decades, in fact within a decade and a half, it became clear that the scale and the volume of investment that would be required for this would become unsustainable for the state over the long term. Hence, in one of the earliest instances of a mechanism called build and transfer, the Japanese government handed over all the industrial ventures that it had built up, dealing with coal, iron and steel production, railways, wagon building, shipbuilding, etc., to private capitalists. This handover, however, was done with a clear understanding that profits would be safeguarded by state and corporates would subordinate their activities to national interest. This was the reason why, in Japan, the economic model involved the state and business interests working in tandem right through the 19th and all through the 20th century, even after, in fact, the major break that 1945 had been. Zaibatsu capitalism developed in 19th century in this background of close private capitalist relationship with the state. The term Zaibatsu, which literally means a wealthy clique, refers to large business conglomerates operating across the spectrum of economic activities, so spreading from mining, through agriculture, through trade and services, through banking, through insurance, across all sectors, where the principal decision-making tended to revolve around a single business family. So people from one business family would be heading a number of different sectors and different enterprises in a number of different sectors, taking a collective decision that was coordinated and calibrated at the head of the business family, which is the head of the Zaibatsu. At least 2 such Zaibatsu houses, the Sumitomo and Mitsui, dated back to the Tokugawa period of the 17th century, while most of the other such houses, including the largest one, Mitsubishi, developed during the Meiji period. They quickly spread across manufacturing and the services sectors by investing the profits of one sector into another. bringing into place both vertical and horizontal integration of business interests. The House of Mitsui, for instance, had begun with a chain of sake shops, wine shops, the proceeds of which were then invested into textiles. The proceeds from the textiles were then later invested into trading, banking, and mining. During the Meiji period, the Mitsui House thus stood in the forefront of all these various sectors when the decision was taken to mechanize, and they came forth and took initiative in the mechanization once the government drove home the imperative need for doing so. Similarly, the Sumitomo Zaibatsu began during the Tokugawa period with bookshops and medicine shops, the profits of which were then invested while diversifying into copper mining. During the Meiji era, beginning with almost 100 years of experience in copper mining, the Sumitomo moved from copper to steel and thence to chemical and machinery manufacturing. Mitsubishi began in the 19th century, began when the government made over its shipbuilding operations to the family and provided them with subvention. The Mitsubishi Zaibatsu eventually moved from shipbuilding to financing, from financing to warehousing, real estate, and eventually banking. And after the Great War, they even moved into iron and steel industry, oil exploration, and even aircraft building. The Zaibatsu not only ventured into enterprises that were built and transferred by the government, they also served to invest in the mechanization of traditional manufacturing system of Japan. This explains why the basic unit of industrial production in Japan remains even today housed in small workshops, comparatively smaller workshops and factories, rather than large factories of the German model. Japan was thus a very unusual example of a late industrializing country that did not resort to a massive capital-intensive mechanization of its production system. Japan stands as a very important alternative developmental paradigm for non-Western societies to follow. So to sum up, in the world outside Europe, capitalism developed essentially in response to the challenge posed by Europe's industrial capitalism. Those that were in close proximity to developments in Europe in terms of the regularity of contact took the gradualist path of economic development from early on, graduating from homegrown capitalist entrepreneurship and were then maturing into full-fledged industrial capitalism on the strength of private capital, the best example being the United States of America. Those that were at some distance from this regular contact resorted to industrial capitalism only when confronted with the adverse effect of the material superiority of the West, almost in self-defense. In most cases, this required some degree of state support, but successful development of industrial capitalism necessitates, it is required and it's absolutely necessary to have domestic mobilization of private capital as well. Japan is the best example of this. Even in the most successful case of state-led industrialization to emerge from the story of 20th century, that is to say China, or even better, the People's Republic of China, it was eventually to become clear that they chose elements of both the US model and the Japanese model, as Kenneth Pomeranz was to argue in his famous work, The Great Divergence.